So we got a few of you. You guys having pretty good luck so far? Yes? No? Okay. I got another question. Has anybody ever seen so many grasshoppers? I got more grasshoppers this year than I've ever seen. Is everybody? It's just horrible. And I don't spray anything at all, so it's all hand-picked. First thing I want to talk about is plant selection. When you're growing blueberries, I grow the ones that taste good to me. You know, you got to get the health benefits, the antioxidants, but the most important is to, eat the blueberries that taste like blueberries. I'm sure the ones in the store, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're kind of watered down to me. So, these are the top 5 for me. Sharp Blue, Spring Wide, Prima Donna, Gulf Coast, and Emerald. And I like the Sharp Blue. It's the standard for all other berries. It was introduced back in '76. It's a large, sweet berry. It's early bearing, and it's fairly easy to grow. Spring Wide is a newer cultivar released by the University of Florida. Very, very good flavor. I really like the flavor of this berry. It's easy to grow. It tends to be a wide, low bush, which is just the shape that I like. Prima Donna, also a very good flavored new cultivar. The chill is about 300 hours, and I'll get into the chill hours in a minute. 300 chill hours is a little bit high for this area, but as cold as we've gotten the last 2 or 3 years, I've never had problems getting the Prima Donna to fruit. Gulf Coast, and Gulf Coast isn't my favorite flavored berry, but it's the best all-around pollinator. And the reason for that is it's almost flowering from late January. Some of mine just stopped flowering. So with Gulf Coast, you get this very long, extended flowering season, and you have ripening berries, and it will still be flowering at the same time. The flavor is sweet and tart. They're not the biggest berries, but they have some good qualities. And Gulf Coast tends to be an upright, narrow bush, so it's good to plant that in between the Sharp Blue, the Spring Wide. The other one I like is Emerald. Very low chill, very easy to grow. The berry flavor to me is somewhat insipid, almost watery. It's large, it's somewhat self-pollinating. Emerald is also very easy to grow. For someone that's had trouble growing blueberries, that's one of the easiest ones is Emerald, like for pies and muffins. For eating out of hand, Sharp Blue and Spring Wide are 2. If you just want to walk out to the bushes like I do and pick them off of there and eat them, that's the best ones. Other ones you can try are Jewel, which can be subject to a root rot disease. It's a good pollinator for Emerald. It's what the commercial growers are planting in their fields, is they're planting Emerald, 90% and 10% Jewel. Windsor, another large berry. I don't really care for this much. This one's another one with the watered down flavor. It's easy to grow. Spring High is another new cultivar, similar to the Spring Wide. It's low chill. I haven't tasted the berry yet, so I'm not sure how good that one is, but it's one of the other new cultivars that's doing well. And I have one that's a real high chill called Le Noir. And this was developed in North Carolina, and I'm growing this one in Titusville for the last 2 years, and it's fruited for me 2 years in a row, and they're saying this one does not fruit here. Now I just started picking the bushes off my Le Noir this week. So this is a bush that will probably be picking into June. Usually blueberries we pick April and May and we're done. So this is something that I'm evaluating as a late season and possibly using Gulf Coast as a pollinator because it's also flowering late. Now moving on to site selection. Anytime you want to grow fruit or berries, always requires full sun. There's about 5% of the fruit trees that you're going to grow in the shade. Almost anything that fruits, berries, fruit, they all require full sun. You may get small amounts of fruit on your bushes if they get 5 to 6 hours, and I have seen them produce some. 8 to 10 hours of sunlight would be a minimum requirement. And make sure when you're planting to consider the angle of the sun, that it gets low in the horizon during the winter, that during the winter time that these aren't being shaded because the sun is low in the horizon. So you have to think, during the summer it's straight overhead, but in the winter it's down. It may be down below some trees, and you may not be getting the sun you need. Remove all the grass, weeds from an area, usually 3 foot by 3 foot for each plant. And normally I would plant these in a raised bed. I prefer to plant them in a container, in a 25-gallon container, or half of a juice barrel. I've had very good luck with them in containers. I'm able to control the pH in the container, in the pot, much easier than to control the pH in the ground and the soil. A shallow raised bed, it doesn't have to be more than like a 12-inch board is fine. You're only going to have to dig down about 6 inches. Make sure you're getting all the tree roots and all other, roots out of there, all the grass out of there. Once you've done that, you can fill that raised bed with the soil mixture. And I have a soil mixture here that I've made up that I'm going to pass around. And what that is 3 parts peat moss, 1 part pine bark fines, and 1 part organic compost. And you can use worm castings, you can use, I use mulch that's been decomposed for a year that the worms have worked through. And you're going to mix that thoroughly together. You have to make sure that these things are growing in an acidic soil, and the pine bark fines and the peat moss are going to give you that. You can try other things, and people say, well, how about this, and how about that, and how about the other? I don't know, but this works for me. The pine needles will work, but it takes 2 to 3 years for that waxy substance on the pine needles to break down. So if you want to use that on top as a dressing so you're not pulling weeds, or even the big chunks of pine barks, you can put that on top of the beds and use that, but that's not for planting it. But that works fine as a mulch. I'd recommend it as a mulch. Neighbors are always raking everything they see that's not green, they're raking it up and throwing it away, and to me, that's like a gold mine to pull up, and here's bags of oak leaves and pine needles all neatly sorted and put in piles for me, and I take them. Of course, they think I'm crazy, but that's okay, because I use that stuff, and that's when you build your soil that way, and that's what it takes to grow blueberries, is you build your soil. You can't grow them in the sand. You're just not going to be able to hold the moisture in the soil for long enough. When you plant your blueberries, make sure you're planting the crown of the plant. The crown of the plant needs to be slightly higher than the soil, so the water all runs off and runs away from the plant. Otherwise, you're going to have root rot problems. Blueberries like constant moisture. They don't like being dried out, but they don't like sitting in water either. That's why I recommend the raised bed. So it has to hold moisture, but it also has to drain off. If we get 3 or 4 days of heavy rain, you want that water to be able to run off and go somewhere. If water sits around these plants for a couple of days, they're really going to suffer and they may die. So we start harvesting in April, usually around April 1st. I'll start picking the berries and I'll be tasting them. and we pick all the way through May and into June. If you can identify the wild blueberries, I meant to bring some tonight, but I ran out of time loading stuff. But there are 3 wild blueberries. There's a shiny, there's one called Darrow's, and there's another native type, very small leaves. And usually around mid-May through about mid-July, we can pick the wild blueberries. And if you find disturbed areas of habitat, upland, with pine and palmettos, and you look around, a lot of times you can find these wild blueberries. Don't dig the plants up, please. The ones I got from Island Grove Nursery, and they'll be selling these, and I'll be in turn selling the native blueberries. But you can find them, I find them all over public parks in Brevard County, in county parks. And I'm sure they're growing around here. So look for areas that have pines and palmettos that have been disturbed, and the blueberries will be about this tall, and the leaves look very similar to these, but they're much, much smaller, much smaller. And if you can, there's several books out there on identifying plants. Before you go and taste something, make sure you know what you're eating. I'm not telling you to go in the woods and eat some plants. Make sure you identify what you're eating. But if you do locate them, the flavor is phenomenal. I'm sure they're packed with more antioxidants than any of these could even come close to. And of course, it's better than organic. It's wild. I usually pick my berries twice a week because I like to wait 3 days after they turn blue to pick them. If someone says, well, how do you know it's been 3 days? I pick twice a week. I'll go in on Wednesday, and then Saturday or Sunday I'll pick again. And I use a bird netting that's about a 1/2 inch by a 1/2 inch square, and I completely cover my rows in this netting. The first year I was fine. I had hundreds of plants, plenty of berries. Towards the end of the season, a group of cedar waxwings moved in, and they'd swoop down. And it's not bad when you have a couple blue jays and cardinals, but this is like hundreds of birds would descend and march through your rows and take off. And they wouldn't come back every day. They'd wait the 2 or 3 days. And they'd line up in the trees, and they just devastated. So the second year I had to buy the netting. So unless you want to feed the birds, I'd recommend some inexpensive netting. I got mine at Berry Hill Irrigation. It was online. They sent me a big roll of it. And I just cut strips over it and just draped it over the bushes. And the birds ate a few on top, but they didn't get them all. Now after we pick them, after we've picked all our berries off, we want to come in and do some pruning. So hopefully you can see me here, but I'm going to pull this out to the corner. We remove any of this dead, remove any of this dead wood, like that. I didn't intend to cut that off, it's my mistake, but you want to leave that. I would also locate a point on this plant, and what you want to do is you want to find a node that's pointing out, because you don't want these branches growing back in over itself. You want it to grow out like an umbrella. So you find a node that's facing out, and I usually pick an area just below these. And as you run your hand down, you can find a little bump, and you're going to cut just above that bump. Now, when they cut these commercially, they get a gas hedge trimmer, and they mount it on a tractor, and they'll go 4 feet high, and they'll just come along with the hedge trimmer and cut them, just like they would an orange grove. And it sounds brutal. But they got acres and acres of these things. Now, I don't cut mine that way, but I don't have acres and acres of blueberries. But if you had a lot of ground to cover, you're not going to sit here with a pair of pruners and cut each and every one of these plants, because you would be days, if not weeks. So normally I would just come in and I just give it a little tip pruning, and that's about the extent of what I cut off a young plant. Off of a mature plant, I would locate the growth. This is this year's growth, and I would normally cut off 1/3 to 1/2 of this year's growth on a mature plant. So at about the 3rd to 4th year, you would start doing that type of pruning. Up until then, you're just pruning for shape. You're cutting out the dead stuff. At that point, you're just cutting off some of the growth, and then you're going to create new sites for branching and flowering. So you're going to have a lot more fruit the following year. You absolutely must prune. You cannot just let them go year after year. They'll get taller and longer and leggier, and in time these canes die. So the other type of pruning you do is removal of a dead cane. And once this cane gets several years old, you would completely cut it out. Because when you're growing blueberries and other small fruits, you're encouraging suckers from the base. Any other fruit tree, a peach or a mango or an apple, you're always clearing the suckers off the bottom. When you're growing blueberries and blackberries, you want the suckers. When the sucker comes up out of the base of the ground, that is your new shoot. That is next year's fruit or the following year. So you want to do everything you can to encourage new shoots. And then you're constantly rejuvenating your bush this way. By cutting out these dead canes and new canes coming up, you always have a new, healthy, strong growth, and you're eliminating the old, dead wood that can become diseased. Fertilizing, I wanted to discuss this. I'm transitioning away from synthetic fertilizers. I want everybody to be clear on that. I've used some. I really don't like to, but I've killed a lot of blueberry bushes this year trying to do this. So I am doing this. What I'm using is I have chickens and turkeys. So I'm using chicken manure and trying to get the pH at that level, 4.8 to 5.2. Blueberries love that pH at 5. You have to maintain that pH. And doing that organically is a challenge. One of the things I'm looking at is this superhuman seaweed, and I'll pass this around. Everybody can have a look at it. And this is what I'm going to be using as a foliar feed. And it's leonardite shale, which is a naturally occurring element, and seaweed. I think that's organic. I'm not sure what the process is to extract the shale, but I'm doing more research on this. But to grow these organically, we're going to have to use some type of foliar spray. These are blueberries that I'm growing, these here. And I use very, very little synthetic fertilizer, a bare minimum on these. These I bought from Hopkins Nursery. These are grown using synthetic time-release fertilizer. And you can see, well, I would rather buy this one than that one too. So this is what I'm up against, is trying to get these to look like that so that people will want to buy them and to encourage the growth. One of the problems I encountered was my well water had a lot more salt in it than I realized. So I've been using a pond water irrigation. A small plot of blueberries you may not be able to irrigate with a shallow well. And I was reading that deep wells may have a pH around 7. So you might want to get your water tested. Blueberries require about 40 inches annual rainfall. So if you can collect your rain in a rain barrel and use this exclusively on your blueberries, you'll probably have pretty good luck. Now the blueberries don't require irrigation all year round. From about December to February or March, they really don't require water. But starting in March, all the way through, they're going to need to be on some type of irrigation and water. If they're flowering and fruiting and you're not watering them, you're going to have a dried up berry that does not taste good at all. So your chill hours, make sure you get this. This is the most important thing for buying any fruit tree, anything that is cold hardy that you're going to plant here, any fruit or berry bush that goes dormant in the wintertime and then comes out of dormancy in the spring and fruits, requires chill hours. Now, a chill hour is defined as 1 hour below 45 degrees. And we start accumulating chill hours in November, and we get them all the way through February into March. It doesn't have to stay 45 degrees for a month. These chill hours accumulate or add up like money in a savings account. You just keep putting them hours in the bank, and they keep going in all winter long. And when you get to the magic 250 or 300, whatever the book says, that thing pops out of dormancy and flowers, right? Well, not necessarily. There's a lot of variables, but normally when the University of Florida says 100 chill hours, that is a minimum. So normally it may do fine with 50 to 75 hours. My friend Eric in Pine Island Nursery in Homestead grows these emeralds and Anna apple and lots of things way down there in Homestead next to Miami, and he consistently gets fruit on these. They're growing emerald a lot further south down around Lake Okeechobee. So a chill hour is subjective, of course, but when your plant accumulates that amount of time, that amount of hours, that's when it's going to break dormancy. Now, if you pick a plant that has a real high chill requirement of 1,000 hours, say you grow this peach up in Georgia and you remember how great it is and you bring it down here and plant it, it may fruit for you occasionally. It may have a lower chill requirement than it actually says. But generally, if you plant plants that have too high of a chill requirement, you're not going to get the hours required to get it to fruit consistently. Or you're going to get it fruit consistently like this year and last year, but if we have a warm year, you're not going to get anything. Now, the alternative to that is to plant something that has a very low chill requirement. And the disadvantage to that would be if it were to break dormancy early, flower, and we had a heavy freeze in March. And if your plant's already pushing, and I had a pecan tree do this last year. My pecan trees pushed out in February, and they were doing good, and then we got a late freeze, and it just knocked them all the way back, and they waited a month and started up again. That's what they did last year. This year, they waited until March. They waited almost a month later to push out. So it's just interesting that the plants knew they got burned last year, they waited this year. So if you planted a low chill blueberry, you probably wouldn't have any problems, because I haven't had any problems with the cold really affecting them. But if you planted like a low chill such as emerald, you get a really hard late freeze, you may lose some fruit and some flowers. But I don't think that's really a concern. Your concern should be, am I getting sufficient chill hours for the plant that I'm buying? You can buy a Brightwell blueberry at Lowe's and Home Depot. They have about 800 or 1,000 chill hours, which is good if you live in Atlanta, but it probably won't do very well here. So one of the things I covered was the root rot. It's usually due to overwatering or poor site selection, where you didn't realize your yard flooded there, and it does. So you want to make sure that there's never any standing water where you plant your blueberries. You can put some blackberries there. They'll do great. But don't put blueberries there. There's a stem blight that affects flowers and buds. It's usually due to excess overhead irrigation. Misty is one of the berries that are affected by the stem blight. For this reason, I do not recommend planting Misty. It's a good tasting berry, and it fruits very, very heavy at a young age, but it fruits so heavy, it just kills itself. It just fruits and dies, it commits suicide. So I don't recommend planting Misty. Gulf Coast would be the alternative to the Misty. One of the other pests I've noticed this year, of course, is the grasshoppers. People say, well, why do your leaves look like this? You know? That's the grasshoppers. So am I going to spray?
No.
I just keep hand picking them. Because I don't want to eat whatever's going to kill that grasshopper. I don't want to eat that. So some of the farms that are doing U-pick over in our area don't spray while they're picking during the fruiting season. I don't ever spray these. The strongest thing, I think, was I mixed up some baby shampoo, spray that on and wash it off. That's about the extent. I haven't noticed them this year, but in past years we've had tent caterpillars. So you want to make sure you're walking through your blueberry bushes and your other trees and looking for a tent, like a white cocoon will build around some of the branches. And they'll get in there, and normally what I would do is I would cut that whole branch away very carefully and put it in a plastic bag and put it in the garbage can and make sure it goes far away. I don't try to pick it off of there because there's eggs in there and you're just going to spread that, so I just cut it off and take the whole thing away. You're saving yourself a lot of trouble by just doing that, and you're going to eliminate, very little fruit the following year. I did bring some other fruits. I'll tell you what. Let's see if we have any questions about blueberries first. Then I'll spend a few minutes on some other things if I have time. In the back? Did everybody hear Haley's question? She has a blueberry bush that's about 2 or 3 years old. The cane is brown, but I guess it only has a little bit of growth, right at the very top, kind of like this. And what I do on that one is I would find a node, and you see how the rest of the bush is about this height?
Yeah.
And you're going to take, isn't that about a third right there? I take about a third of that out, and I find a node that's facing out, because you're always growing it like that, because you never want bushes or branches crossing over the center that blocks the sunlight, and that will cause problems by not having sunlight open to the center of the bush. You're going to have moisture accumulate. It's good to have sun in the center. It's going to allow new branching and new growth and eliminate a lot of disease and pest problems. Once you get the pH up, it's hard to get it back down. Don't waste your money on one of these, by the way. I bought this for like $5. Just don't even waste your money. I thought I could buy these for $5 and maybe, sell them for $7 or $8, but this doesn't work. I have this expensive meter that works great, and it's hard for people to go out and to justify growing 10 or 15 blueberries and paying for this. I think this one was like around 125 or so. Usually I start in February and I fertilize every 2 months. So it'd be February, April, June, just prior to pruning, because we started pruning in June. So usually I hit them like usually the first of the month is when I like to fertilize things. So I do the 1st of February, 1st of April, 1st of June, 1st of August, done. Don't fertilize after August. No, I tend to be constant. With blueberries, you have to be really careful not to over-fertilize. If I'm growing little 1-gallon plants, I'll fertilize that every month.
How much?
Maybe like half a shot glass, if you can. I mean, it's just a pinch, just a sprinkle in there. I started growing these with chicken manure. And my chicken manure isn't pure manure, it's a mix from, there's hay in there, I throw peat moss in there, and then let the chickens use that as bedding, and then I scrape the peat moss back out, put that back on the blueberries. Because you remember I was saying the peat moss, you need that? So I let the chickens process it for me. I put it back on there. For peat moss, I'm probably using, with the chicken manure in it, maybe about a coffee cup equivalent with this, and realize it has hay and other materials mixed in. Organic fertilizer is not a science. I mean, it fluctuates and varies. With blueberries, you do not want to over-fertilize. You're better to be on the light side than on the heavy side. It's hard to take it away once you've already put it on there, but you can always add more. Over here?
On the peat moss that you're adding to your soil mix, is that Canadian sphagnum peat or is it Florida peat?
That's Canadian peat. Over here?
Hey, you mentioned before that one of the plants does poorly, I think you said Misty does poorly with overhead watering. When you talk about like using raised beds for blueberries, is drip irrigation okay, or what would you recommend for it?
I would recommend drip irrigation. Generally, some of the growers use overhead for cold protection, but I've never used any cold protection on any of my blueberries in the last 20 years. They've gone through, 24 last December. It was 21 degrees the January before that. My blueberries were blooming, were never affected. So I would say stick to the drip irrigation. It's better for our environment, of course. You're putting the water down to the roots, right to the plants where they need it. You're not watering the weeds and the grass and everything else. Over here? In a row, I would put them 3 to 4 feet. I wouldn't go less than 3. I wouldn't go over 4. That works best for me. You make your row, as long as you want. And I've also seen another planting where they did a double row and they put the irrigation down the middle, but I didn't care for that because to pick in the center, you had to either climb into the middle of the planting and trip over all the irrigation, all the microjet. So I prefer a single row planting. Her question was, are there any companion plants that I would use for pollinators? I would encourage bumblebees to come into your yard. A honeybee carries 400 to 600 grains of pollen on its legs. A bumblebee, carries 3,200 to 4,000 grains of pollen on its legs. So bumblebees are superior pollinators for your blueberries. So if you can do things to get bumblebees into your yard, I have small patches of weeds around the nursery, like Spanish needles, the bidens, because they flower all summer. Lantana, butterfly bush. There's any number of native plants that are going to keep the pollinators coming into your yard. Look for natives or plants that are flowering from February into March. Because February and March is when your blueberries are flowering, so that's when you want to find other things flowering. She had 2 questions. Did everybody hear? Okay. The pine mulch or pine straw would be fine to use as a top dressing. The keratin, the waxy substance in the pine needles, takes 2 to 3 years to break down. And it's wonderful to suppress the grass around your blueberries and to keep things from growing because it continually acidifies. But I don't know that I'd recommend mixing that in the soil because it's going to take 2 to 3 years for that to break down to start doing its job of acidifying. But it worked fine as a top dressing. The chicken manure, I'm kind of using it pretty fresh. I'm really not composting it a lot. It may be a month or so old. But I'm just gathering it up dry, and putting it on there a little bit at a time. And I want to add this superhume as a foliar spray, and we'll see how it goes. Another question in the back? The question was how you would propagate blueberries. A lot of these cultivars are licensed by the University of Florida. Now, there's two that I brought that are not, the Gulf Coast and the Sharp Blue, which were released back in the 70s. I think Sharp Blue was released in 76. We are legally allowed to propagate and cultivate that without a license from Florida Foundation seed producers. Legally, any one of you cannot take a cutting off of this plant and grow it as a new plant, nor can you sell it, and you can't give it to somebody else for them to plant. How they're going to find out all that, I don't know, but they do some checking, believe me. I found out from someone in the business, they do check. What I would do on the blueberries is I would wait until mid to late June, around the time we do our pruning. And of course you need a mist house for propagation. If you don't have a mist house, you will not get your blueberry cuttings to root. Your blueberry cutting is taken when the wood is not brown and woody and not green, but right in between. It's a semi-hardwood cutting. And I use what's called Olivia's cloning gel. Olivia's cloning gel is the only cloning solution food safe approved. Any of your other root growth hormones are not approved for growing food plants. So that's why I picked Olivia's. I would take the cutting 6 to 8 inches. Hold that for me. Bring it in there. So I would take this cutting. This would be my cutting, about 6 to 8 inches. Strip the leaves off. Normally I trim them off with scissors. I leave all but the top 2 or 3 leaves. Do a fresh cut. Dip that in hormone, and then you're going to place this in a misting bed. And it usually takes 6 to 8 weeks, and you'll get cuttings. And I get maybe 50 to 75% of my cuttings take. I've been doing this a while. So they're not the easiest thing. Timing is everything. This cutting would probably work. You can see it's green, it's got a little red on it. It's just starting to turn. It's not green and whippy like this one. It's just a little bit stiff. If it's real soft and pliable and green, it won't root. If it's real hard and woody, it won't root.
Are you rooting them in rooting cubes, or are you using vermiculite, perlite, or?
I would use 50-50 peat and perlite. Make sure if you're propagating these things, you're not propagating patented varieties. I ain't getting in trouble either.
Steve told us we could.
Yeah, Steve said so. It's real hard to get these things. I can buy these as cuttings fairly inexpensively. A cutting like that rooted would be about, $1.25 to $1.50 a plant. So do you want to spend the time doing that when you can just buy a whole tray already grown? I think I'm about out of time here. Is that it, Terry?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.